Dr. Croston, this is Samantha Bragg. So this will be my video for our fusion paper for PS625. The topic that I chose to do was which nation hates America the most and why. And I kind of took a chance and decided to go with America hates America the most, and it was definitely a lot more challenging than I thought it was. But I kind of just harped on the threat of U.S. patriot groups within the United States. So I took a look at these patriot groups and the effect that they have on our nation. So really, these groups are anti-government groups that take matters into their own hands and sometimes create militias that they feel would be necessary if and when the government was to decide to turn on its citizens. So as we know, not everyone's going to agree with the policies that the government pursues, but that's the great thing about this nation is that as citizens we are able to openly disagree in a peaceful manner without any fear of severe repercussions. So in 2010, as a nation, we saw a rise in these anti-government patriot groups. In 2009, the number was 512, and in 2010, it was 824. One report that I found noted that this growth was due to the opposition of the government and frustration of how the government was handling the economy, also due to the changing role of the demographics in the nation and the mainstreaming of multiple conspiracy theories. So what I found really interesting about these groups is that a lot of scholars argue that the most patriotic individuals were the ones who rose against their government when it violated moral principles. And so while that may be true, what I found in my research was that many of these patriot groups take that statement to the extreme and find issues and things that don't really warrant the type of overreaction that they portray. So the major issue and threat of these patriot groups is that there's no clear-cut policy regarding this type of domestic terrorism. So in court, if you were to take a domestic terrorist anti-government individual to court, since there's no real statute in place for how these individuals need to be tried, it makes it really easy for prosecutors to try them as they please. So it means that they could be tried as a terrorist or they could be tried as a regular criminal for something like a hate crime. There's no clear-cut statute on how to deal with these type of individuals. And due to that, because there is no real account for how to prosecute these type of groups and individuals, it makes it extremely difficult for the public to fully grasp the severity of domestic terrorism if they're not falling under the terrorist cover, I guess. So the individuals who partake in these patriot groups are under the impression that the government is being destructive to their fundamental rights. I found it really ironic and interesting that these groups believe that the U.S. government is doing everything in its power to undermine democratic rights, but pretty much every other nation in the world looks to the United States as the founding nation of democracy in a sense. But this is also what makes it so difficult for the United States to combat the issue of patriot groups because it does work so diligently to uphold the given rights of each citizen. So the next section of my paper reviews current policy and its effectiveness. So the current policy and statutes regarding anti-government groups is very complex. Of course, there's the issue of First Amendment rights that come into play when attempting to convict a patriot group member of a crime. Some believe that a person cannot receive excessive hardship on the basis that they have committed a hate crime because it violates their rights, but that they must be punished for engaging in criminal activity rather than motives of a hate crime. However, there are others that believe when a person's identity is attacked, that criminals should receive more of a hardship in their sentence. The fact that there is so much fluctuation and difference between each case regarding patriot group members makes it difficult to say that there's a clear-cut way in which the government actively deals with these groups. One issue that comes about from this is that different agencies within the government regard domestic terrorism in a different light. So the difference of definition makes it difficult to accurately assess whether or not a group falls under this domestic terrorist cover. Not only is there a difference in definition, but there's no public listing of groups that are considered domestic terrorists. So, national security expert Jonathan Masters notes that there is a lack of uniformity in the way that domestic terrorists are prosecuted. So he goes on to note that because the terms terrorists and extremists are used interchangeably, it allows the sort of flexibility for prosecutors and policymakers to not have to actually label these individuals as terrorists. This shows that there's a complete ambiguity and confusion when it comes to domestic terrorism and the prosecution of these groups. So the next section in my paper kind of goes over other nations and how they deal with their anti-government groups. So what makes the situation of patriot groups within the U.S. so complex is that, like we stated before, it is difficult to prosecute individuals on the basis that they oppose government policies and decisions. Other nations, however, are not so inclined to upholding the rights of their citizens. So for the purpose of this paper, I chose to use the example of the Falun Gong group in China and the way in which China chose to deal with this group. So the Falun Gong was a quasi-religious movement who sought acceptance from the Chinese government in hopes to end harassment from them. The Chinese government ended up responding by banning this group outright, stating that they were conspiring with overseas pro-democratic and anti-China forces to overthrow the Chinese government. And the individuals of this group who opposed the government's ban were sometimes detained or beaten with electronic batons. So this is kind of a case of how a non-democratic nation would deal with an opposition group, but it has to be noted that not all anti-government groups are unsuccessful. To prove this point, I chose to use the recent Arab Spring as an example of anti-government groups being able to overcome neglect of governments. So as you know, we saw in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Syria, they all had groups which yearned for a more democratic way of life, and they were definitely dissatisfied with their governments and the way that they were ruling. So we all watched as we saw groups in Egypt and Libya successfully overthrow their existing regimes. The difference between these examples and the issue with the U.S. is that within the U.S., these rebellious citizens know that because they reside in this democratic nation, there's little that can be done to actually punish them for, being rebellious and having that opposition. And it almost seems like they take advantage of their democratic rights by complaining about them. So the next section, I kind of go over, what causes this patriot group phenomenon. There's actually really little published about the origins of these patriot groups and how exactly they came about. And this is actually what I found for most of this research, is that there's not very much about it, and it makes it difficult to actually, get the facts straight. But the more recent and prevalent answer to these groups, like having emerged in recent years, is due to the election of Obama. Many of these groups believe that Obama and his administration is out to trample on individual freedoms and civil liberties. While many cite racism as the cause of this, there's still great distrust of government and belief of conspiracies by all of those taking on this ideology. So it's not just the racism factor, it is a huge distrust with the government. I also found that mainstream media plays a very important role with the anti-government movement within the U.S. Excuse me. Many news sources seem to advocate and promote the anti-government views and anger. So by allowing these individuals from these groups the opportunity to promote their views and beliefs, it kind of only allows for them to draw more individuals into their ways of extreme notions and conspiracy theories. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Another theory I found of how these patriot groups came about in the U.S. is due to the economic turmoil in the 1970s, when approximately 1 million people were removed from their farms because they were unable to compete with the economy. So many believe that these anti-government sentiments came from this economic turmoil and were further fueled by religiously grounded anti-government groups within the region. One theory that I found very interesting was that the current American bipartisan political system could potentially allow for the emergence of right-wing extremism, or even left-wing extremism. So because the two parties are allowed to continue to grow further apart, as they have been, political environment becomes less centrist, and the right or left may feel compelled to exert themselves. So the last section of my paper is the policy that I believe needs to happen in the United States regarding these patriot groups. So it's really clear that there is no real policy or action that has or is being taken on these patriot groups. With these groups having existed for decades, there's little documentation which suggests that a preventive plan was ever put in place. So using the UK as a mentor, the U.S. could implement a community assistance program to counter the recruitment and publicity of these patriot group ideas. This tactic could essentially create a better relationship between the government and its citizens, which could in turn help diminish the hostility and negative sentiments that the anti-government groups are able to harp on and recruit more individuals. Another theory to eradicate the patriot group issue would be to engage in extreme measures. These measures would potentially go against democratic principles. So while this theory may seem like the lesser evil, I would argue that by doing this, it does exactly what the anti-government groups believe in, and it would kind of give them more incentive to oppose the government. But, so by the government using non-democratic principles to eradicate the issue could potentially only cause the issue to grow. So of course we know that there will always be dissatisfaction in a democratic nation, but being in a democratic nation allows for citizens to lawfully protest and voice their concerns without fear of unfair treatment. So it's when these groups begin to take their freedoms out of context and to the extreme when it becomes a problem, and policy should reflect an adequate course of action when this does happen. A prevention plan incorporating communities and citizens, I believe, would prove to be beneficial and would create more of a trustful and positive relationship between the government and its citizens, which in the long run could lessen the amount of recruits into patriot groups. So I guess the last point that I make in this paper is that the definition and repercussions should also be streamlined so that all who fall under the domestic terrorism realm are all prosecuted in a similar manner rather than the scattered way it's dealt with now. So that's pretty much it for this paper. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next semester. Thanks.